Hi, and welcome to this Vention assembly video. My name is David, and I work here as part of the hardware design team at Vention. In this video, we're going to take a special look at some of our actuators, motors, powertrain components, linear guide systems, and other components to understand a little bit some of the nuances and special parts. Starting over here on the left, we have the ball screw. This actuator comes completely pre-assembled. The only thing that's left to do upon receiving it is installing the motor on the motor mount here and fastening the fastener in the coupling to properly attach the motor shaft to the coupling. The next actuator we have here is the timing belt. This actuator also comes completely pre-assembled, and it even comes with a timing belt pre-tensioned. If you were ever to require to retension the belt, just note that the two fasteners of the tensioner are found underneath the gantry and can be tightened with a standard Allen key. Moving on to the rotary actuator here, it is composed of a top plate, a bottom plate, and a slewing gear in between the two. This all comes already assembled, and all that's required to do upon receiving the parts is to install this pinion on the motor, and then after that's done, installing the motor with the pinion into this hole here and engaging it with the slewing gear. Once that's complete, you can mount this on whichever frame you need, and your rotary actuator is good to go. Our next actuator on the list is the rack and pinion, and this is one of our only actuators that we don't ship already assembled. This is because of the modular nature of the actuator, which requires assembly on site. So to start off, we're going to start by sliding in a T-nut and this special support nut in the extrusion for our first rack segment. Sliding these all the way to the end. And then taking one of our end stops with the two fasteners, like so, and installing them into the nuts. Leave this special nut, which is the front closer fastener, loose for now, as we'll tighten it later. Now taking the rack segment, as the specialty support nut is over there, we can see this feature on the rack is a relief cut. So we'll be inserting that side first. Now make sure that the support nut properly engages with the rack, coming underneath it, and now we can properly tighten this nut, which pulls the rack up and fixes it in place. For the sake of the demo, we're only demonstrating with one segment, but if you were to have multiple segments, we would now install a set screw here, and then slide the next rack segment over, which would successfully cover the feature and allow us to have a seamless rack. However, since this is the end of the rack segment for this demonstration, I will now install the other end stop. So this side threads directly into the rack on the first screw, and then the second screw is installed with a standard Vention T-nut. Finally, all that's left to complete is installation of your linear guides, which we've already done beforehand, and the installation of the pinion housing on the actuator. The pinion housing, as the name implies, houses the rack and pinion, as well as a shaft, and allows for the installation of a motor. Simply place it directly on top while lining up the holes for the bearings. And once everything is in place, you may fasten the bearings, and you're good to go. Just like that, we would install all of the other bearings as well. So both the rack and pinion, as well as the rotary actuator, operate using gears. And because of this, we recommend using an NLGI Class 2 grease to lubricate the surfaces between the static and the moving gear surfaces. Now moving on here, we have our motor family for the NEMA 34. So NEMA 34 means that they all share the same locating feature as well as locations of mounting holes. All of our motors also use a common 14mm diameter shaft with a 5mm feather key. We have a small, medium, and large motors, which basically changes the torque performance, which depends on the application. Moving on, we also have some powertrain components. Here we have a NEMA 34 power-off brake, which has a NEMA 34 input section, as well as a NEMA 34 output. This allows for installation on one of our motors, and then also onto one of our actuators. Here we have a 5-to-1 reduction gearbox. Again, has a NEMA 34 input and a NEMA 34 output. Take a special note here that the input side has a clamping collar and requires that you tighten the hidden fastener in through the side for proper function before using the actuator. Also note that if you do have a gearbox and a brake in the same assembly together, it is very important that the brake go before the gearbox as opposed to after. If the brake is installed after the gearbox can overload the brake, causing the brake to fail, and it won't stop the intended loads. Moving on to our linear guide system, we have two main systems. One is with a linear bearing, along with the linear shaft. And this is a pillow block bearing housing with bearing elements on the inside. It's very important to note that this gray sleeve should not be removed from the bearing, as it is what's protecting all the little bearing elements from coming out during use before installation. So the correct way to remove this sleeve is to simply take the pillow block bearing and slide it directly onto the shaft like so. The plastic insert element will fall out and can be kept for later use. One case of later use that you might want to keep the sleeve for is if the bearing ever needs to be removed from the shaft. In such a case, it is required to use these, or else, as I mentioned, you may have bearing elements that fall out. So simply place it at the end of the shaft and slide the bearing onto the insert. Doing so will prevent any of the bearing elements from falling out and allow you to successfully remove your bearing. Our next linear guide system is the roller wheels. So here we have two different types, a concentric type, which we can note because there's no flat surfaces on the side, and an eccentric. Any linear guide system using these rollers will be mounted on a gantry system. You can note that their installation locations are indicated by these shallow counterbores. And it should also be installed in such a way that on one side there are two concentric rollers, and on the other side there are two eccentric rollers. The eccentric rollers are used to adjust the preload on the two rollers where they engage with the extrusion so that the linear guide system is properly pre-tensioned. Now moving on to our pneumatic system. First, in the pneumatic system, we have our air prep station and pressure regulation. So our input hose here is 8 millimeters and also comes with a quick connect shop air connection. This station allows you to both regulate the pressure, as well as in the bottom we have a filter which separates air and also filters the air. Next, the air exits this regulator and prep station and enters here into the manifold. Again, this is an 8 millimeter tube at the manifold entrance. The manifold functions by taking electronic input, which controls each individual valving system. So you can create a program and using these inputs, control which air travels to where. The air, when activated at a valve, goes through the output tubing of whichever direction you actuate the valve and will actuate your pneumatic cylinder, like so. It should be noted that the tubing used between the manifold and the actuator is 6 millimeters. And finally, we have our conveyor roller. The conveyor rollers can be installed at as many lengths as desired, and one simple note for installation is that there is a fixed side as well as a sprung side. Take note that this side moves when depressed, whereas this side is fixed. So when doing the installation, the correct method to install it into the support is installing the fixed side, depressing the sprung side, moving it to the other hole location on the other side of the support, and releasing the shaft. It is also extremely important to ensure that you install all of the required belts before installing the roller segment, as you won't have access to that afterwards. Thank you so much for watching this Vention assembly video, and please check out the other ones in the series.